Next, may I raise the issue about the current assessment of human rights in DPRK shortly? So we know that there has been a lot of problems in terms of DPRK human rights problems, but after the COVID situation, we have quite limited information about what's happening in North Korea. And also, North Korean government adopted the so-called reactionary ideology and cultural rejection law in December 2020, banning North Korean people from distributing or watching media originating from foreign countries, particularly the South Korea. And also we have climate crisis. And we think North Koreans as a reclusive country, and they probably will suffer mostly from this climate crisis as well. So in light of these all areas, what do you think the current situations in the context of DPRK human rights situation?
I think the COVID pandemic has had a very serious impact in North Korea. Unfortunately, I think we are not able to find out how serious those problems are because of the lack of information. You've mentioned the problem of North Korea restricting access to information. What was a problem and what is a problem is we have very limited information about what's going on inside North Korea. It used to be that there were journalists who were allowed to go to North Korea periodically. They were carefully controlled in North Korea, but they were able to see, they were able to visit areas. Diplomats were active in North Korea. They didn't travel a lot, but they were able to carry out their business there. And there were tourists, visitors who were able to come to North Korea, and some of them were knowledgeable enough to bring back information that was helpful. Because of COVID, these sources of information have been largely cut off. There are very few foreigners, there are very few diplomats who remain in Pyongyang. Many countries, most countries, in fact, no longer maintain full diplomatic relations with diplomats there because of the COVID restrictions. So it's been very difficult to keep up with what's actually going on in North Korea. It makes things difficult in terms of trying to understand how the situation is in North Korea. The information we have been able to see through satellites and border observations that have been conducted by the South Korean government largely, but to a large extent, the US has also followed these events. The information does not look very encouraging. The situation is serious, restrictions on movement of people. North Korea has always been a difficult country to move even within the country. It's become even more difficult because of the COVID restrictions. At the same time, because of the COVID restrictions, it's much more difficult for imports coming into North Korea. North Korea was heavily dependent on China for food aid and other things. And a lot of food assistance, medicines, humanitarian assistance from UN and other countries has not been able to be carried out in North Korea. And the result is things, I think, are worse than they have been, but it's very difficult for us to document fully how serious the conditions are inside North Korea. And I think this has made it very difficult to know what's going on in North Korea, what the concerns are, and what might happen because of that.
Okay, the last part of the questions are about the relation between North Korean nuclear and missile programs and North Korean human rights problem. So we know that the international community has implemented sanctions against DPRK. for its nuclear missile programs, and the negotiations for denuclearization has been locked in the stalemate. So how can we advance the North Korean nuclear problem with a relations with humanitarian problems? So how likely is the U.S. to fully integrate human rights issues into its overall DPRK policy, and also how can we further this situation with an effort to improve to DPRK human rights problems with the international community as a whole?
Yeah, I think the United States has tried uh, in terms of the sanctions that have been imposed by the United Nations and in terms of the unilateral sanctions that the United States has imposed on North Korea because of its missile and nuclear programs. We've tried to sanction the kind of goods that will contribute to the nuclear program, but not sanction or limit or prohibit humanitarian products that North Korea would like to import. Uh, Food, medicines in particular, and particularly important now with COVID. These kinds of things, we've tried to make them available. In some cases, we've gone a little too far. I think we have been too restrictive in the past on American non-government organizations having opportunity to travel to North Korea back before that was when that was still possible. So I think it's a balance of how do you limit the nuclear weapons. On the other hand, how do you prevent North Korea from abusing trade that's allowed for contributing to the nuclear and missile programs. And I think that's the question: is how do you balance them? The UN has also dealt with the same kind of problem, and we've tried to work to do that. The difficulty is the North Koreans are quite willing to take humanitarian food supplies, for example, that are provided and sell them rather than provide them to their people so they can have additional resources to use for their missile and nuclear programs. And so this makes it complicated because the North Koreans do not have a willingness to restrain their actions in order to feed their own people. And this, I think, is one of the problems that we face.
It's very hard to connect the North Korean nuclear problems with human rights when North Korea is not willing to improve their own people's welfare at any cost.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And one of the real difficulties we've had is monitoring what's going on. We were talking about this in the context of COVID because that's made it more difficult to monitor what's going on. We've tried to get around some of these limitations through increased use of satellite photography. And this is something that has been done. It's been very interesting in the last 3 or 4 years. There has been an increased use of satellite photography to look at North Korea and try to determine what's going on in the human rights field. There are a number of reports that have been produced. CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in the U.S., has done reports looking at missiles and other things, but they've also looked at some of the prison camps and some of these other things. The Committee for Human Rights in North Korea has done some excellent reporting using satellite imagery to be able to look at what's going on in North Korea, even though we don't have people on the ground, even though we can't freely circulate and ask questions. When I was the special envoy for North Korea human rights issues, I'm going to tell you just a quick story here. One of the things that we found is I was able, in my position, to have access to classified information the U.S. government had provided, satellite imagery and so forth. And on one occasion, I was shown a satellite photograph of a public execution being carried out. It was at the military school just outside of Pyongyang. And the satellite imagery showed a series of buses driving up to the firing range of the school there, the military school. And then there was a special reviewing stand where people were taken and filled the stands. And then at the other end of the field, there were probably 6 individuals who were tied to poles who were shot. And this was all on satellite imagery. It was quite by accident that they happened to have the satellites focused at that point at that time. I was able, and it took me 2 or 3 months to get it done, to get that information unclassified so that it could be shown publicly to indicate what the North Koreans were doing. And that information has been available out there. And it has shown what goes on in North Korea. So the satellite imagery has been very helpful in terms of helping in the human rights area. It's extremely important for missiles. It's also important for human rights when we're able to identify prisons and human rights violations actually taking place. So there's some good news in terms of being able to increase what we're able to see.
I didn't know the satellite has been useful in the field of human rights as well. That's a very striking story.
Yeah, no, that was very helpful.
I see. Thank you. Lastly, I heard last year I traveled to DC and met some Korean watchers, and there was some worry and concern that in the US there are so many foreign policy issues such as Ukraine and US-China relations. So the North Korean issue has been not so salient in terms of priority. So do you feel that in the current situation?
Yeah, it is very difficult when we've got Ukraine and
Right.
all of the other problems we've got going on, particularly problems in that area with China and those difficulties. My sense is that the United States would like to make progress, and we do have people who are involved, who are experienced, who have dealt with negotiations with the North Koreans on the nuclear issue. We have had continuing efforts on human rights, even though we have not had a special envoy for the last several years. There continues to be an effort to try to engage the North Koreans on a lot of these issues. My sense is the real problem is the North Koreans' unwillingness to engage with us. The North Koreans and the Trump effort to engage with North Korea, the 2 meetings that took place, which produced very little, and the last one produced more negative than positive, has made it very difficult to re-engage with North Korea. So I think this experience was not positive. The other thing that's probably more important is that North Korea is preoccupied with COVID, what's been going on for the last 3 years. And I think there is a concern about how do you maintain control under increasingly difficult circumstances. And I think the North Koreans are just they're not willing to engage because of these other kinds of things that are taking their time, their effort, their energy. And that, I think, is the unfortunate problem right now.
Right. That's a very good point. Very good point. North Koreans and the willingness to come out. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I really appreciate your participation. We will